All right, good morning, everybody. Sorry again for not being able to be here live with you. Just lost track of time and dates being quarantined. I don't know if that a calendar really or clock really matters anymore, and I just lost track. What we're going to do today is really interesting from the perspective of this is a Western civilization class, and so we really haven't looked eastward in the Orient yet. But there is in the early part of the 19th century an Asian country that all of a sudden becomes very westernized on its own, and that is Japan. Change is never easy, whether it's moving to a new school, meeting a new group of friends, or simply trying a new recipe for dinner. Change can be a scary and uncertain thing. In fact, the Japanese rulers of the early modern period were so afraid of change and foreign influence that they refused to allow foreigners to even land on the islands for nearly 250 years prior to the mid 19th century. Perhaps even more surprising is the enthusiasm with which Japan changed after contact was returned with the West in the 19th century. So, just to give you some background about Japan, prior to the beginning of the Tokugawa shogunate, a shogun is like a military general, and they never did not have an emperor. Don't get me wrong, the Japanese emperor has been a continuous line for over 1,000 years. But the emperor was very weak, and while the shogun said he worked for the emperor, the shogun was the real power, and the Tokugawa family were the longest serving line of dynastic shoguns. So at the beginning of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1603, Japan had traded widely with China and other regional powers in East Asia. And indeed, Japan had maintained tenuous trading relations with a few European powers after the West's discovery of Japan in 1542, when a Portuguese ship bound for China was blown off course. But as the Tokugawas consolidated their power over the islands, they became increasingly suspicious of foreigners, especially those Westerners who had successful trading relations with the previous regime that they had defeated in war, and kind of saw them as, okay, they were allies of our enemy. So in the first decades of the shogunate, the Japanese rulers banned foreign trade and prohibited the spread of Christianity, because that's what a lot of Westerners, like a lot of other places, were coming into Japan to proselytize, to go out and spread the word of Christ. So finally, in 1639, they banned foreigners from the Japanese mainland entirely, only allowing some heavily restricted trade with Chinese and Dutch merchants on outlying islands who had no record of Christian evangelization. In 1641, this strict isolationist policy was officially implemented, and Japanese subjects were barred from leaving the islands altogether. And this policy remained in effect in Japan for over 2 centuries. The system was sternly enforced under the power of the shogunate. As a matter of fact, there are tales of Portuguese sailors crashing on a Japanese island and the Japanese immediately beheading them. And of course, they weren't there to do trade, proselytize. They just happened their ship crashed, and instead of helping them out, they're just like foreigners off with their head. So, but the power of the shogunate began to wane in the mid 19th century due to financial problems arising from the decay of the Japanese feudal system. So some level of industrialization was happening in France, and the same thing that had happened in 16th century England, for example, with industrialization, merchants becoming wealthy, noblemen losing some of their wealth, was happening in Japan. So a series of famines, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions didn't help that in the early 19th century. It caused revenue for the ruling samurai, or the knightly aristocratic class, to fall, and they attempted to recoup these losses through increased taxation of the poor. Of course, the poor are having their own troubles, so you can imagine increasing their taxes was not favorably accepted. So the taxation fell upon the poorer parts of society who could least afford to pay, and popular riots swept across the islands. Additional pressure to the system was brought by those same foreign powers that had been shut out of Japan 2 centuries earlier. Part of capitalism is you need to expand your markets in order to expand your business and create more wealth. So Western powers were out looking all over the world, who can we sell to more? That included the United States. And Japan was a market that had not yet been touched. And so they wanted open so they could sell stuff to them. So in the 17th century, Russia tried unsuccessfully to force Japan to open up to foreign trade, and similar expeditions were made by Western European nations in the early 18th century. It was not until the United States sent a war fleet to Japan under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry that Japan was forced to open up its ports to foreign traders. He basically sat these steam-powered naval ships outside the Japanese islands in clear view in Tokyo Harbor. And the shogun was basically like, what are those big metal monstrosities out there? We can't compete with the world. If anybody wanted to invade us, we're in trouble. We've got to modernize. So Perry's 4 ships anchored in Tokyo Bay within sight of the Japanese capital, and the new stern ships blowing with smoke amazed the Japanese, who, because of their stern isolationism, had yet to have contact with Western industrialization. And the display was intended to be dramatic. Perry believed that only a show of force would compel the Japanese to open up to foreign trade. And after giving the Japanese leaders a series of gifts, Perry left Tokyo Bay, informing the leaders he would return the following year, expecting a decision from the Japanese rulers as to whether they would begin trading with the West. The United States was interested in opening Japan to foreign trade for several reasons. With the annexation of California, the U.S. now possessed a huge swath of land on the Pacific coast and therefore became more interested in Pacific trade and establishing some regional hegemony or power on the Pacific side of the United States. Additionally, the recent opening of China to foreign trade meant U.S. ships needed friendly ports from which to refuel. They couldn't cross the whole Pacific at that time without stopping at several ports to bring on more coal. And Japan was seen as a natural rest stop because if you look at it on a map, it's kind of halfway between China and California. And finally, Perry's steamships represented perhaps the U.S.'s greatest interest in the opening of Japan, the acquisition of Japanese resources. And indeed, steamships required large quantities of coal to continue running, and Japan was long thought to be rich in coal. So in the year after Perry's ominous visit, debate about how to respond raged across Japan. They knew they would not be any military match for industrialized Western nations. And in the end, the Tokugawa shogunate caved to Western demands, and in 1854 signed a treaty with the United States agreeing to open up 2 ports to foreign trade. In 1858, the 2 countries signed an additional treaty, opening up trade in even more cities across the Japanese coast, and even allowing foreigners to reside in a few select Japanese cities. The decision proved disastrous for the Tokugawa shogunate, though. Japan was already in economic straits before the Perry expedition, and the flood of foreign currency caused hyperinflation, and the whole Japanese economy collapsed as a result. And a lot of samurai leaders soon began calling for reform and change. And in 1867, the Tokugawa shogunate fell, replaced by the traditional Japanese emperor, though the real power in Japan was held by several of the most powerful samurai still. A great movie about this, not entirely historically accurate, but gives you a feel of what's going on in Japan at this time, is The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise. Of course, he has to inject himself, a white Irish person, into Japanese history somehow. So not very historically accurate, but so the system evolved into something akin to the constitutional monarchies of the West, basically. So following the institution of the Meiji emperorship in 1867, the samurai began instituting a series of reforms to both deal with the influx of foreign trade in Japan and ready the country for its own industrialization. And during the next half century, the Japanese completed modernizing reforms with astounding speed. Railroads and telegraphs soon connected parts of Japan, which only a few years before had been several days of travel apart. In response to foreign trade, Japan's domestic shipping industry grew exponentially. They were very hungry for technology and industry, and they were, grasping at it like, a starving man on a Christmas ham, to quote a line from Remember the Titans. And so they were, rushing into this. Additionally, the rulers of the Meiji period implemented a strict Westernization of Japanese culture. So they got rid of, the traditional bowing to the samurai and, wearing the armor and the samurai sword and everything. You wore Western style dress, suits, things like that. So educational reforms were introduced and Western style universities were founded so that the people could learn how to operate in this new industrial era. A centralized army replaced the semi-feudal daimyo system, which had previously existed, and the existing Japanese class system was eliminated. The traditional ruling class, the samurai, was eliminated, and they were stripped of their symbolic right to carry swords in public. However, not all were happy with Japanese westernization and industrialization, especially the samurai, which is what is depicted in that movie, The Last Samurai, that I talked about. They had been stripped of their traditional rights. And in response, a lot of samurai joined the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877. The rebellion itself was short-lived and was annihilated by the standardized westernized Japanese military. And there is a somewhat semi-historical occurrence that is depicted in that movie, The Last Samurai, at the end of the movie, where there's this great samurai charge on armored horseback with their swords drawn, and the modern Meiji army just guns them down with machine guns. So the rebellion is often seen as the last stand of the samurai and the last obstacle to Japan's full-fledged westernization in the second half of the 19th century. And that full-fledged westernization and their desire to be seen as a powerful member state in the world that could defend itself, thereby discouraging other people from taking advantage of it, and the need for resources to fuel that industry to do that is kind of what led to the events of World War II as in regards to Japan anyway. So that's all I have for today. Very short presentation. I will be back live Tuesday, so hopefully see you then. And I apologize again for not being able to be live today, but again, doctor's appointment, family circumstances prevented me from doing that. So look forward to seeing you Tuesday, and thanks for coming out and attending.